Hi everybody, this is information related to Lab 1, but it's also really important information because this is going to be about your research project for the rest of the semester. So as you heard in the welcome video, that what we're going to be doing in this class, as opposed to a face-to-face class pre-COVID, is we're going to be doing a research project, but you're going to be doing it individually. And we're not going to be collecting data because there's a lot of ethical and other problems with trying to do that online. And so for the research project and your research papers and the poster that you're going to present at the end of the semester, you're going to be taking some actual data that actual psychological researchers have collected and answering some research questions that you're going to devise. And so Uh, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over three possible projects that you can do. And as I'm doing it, take note of a few things. One is you're not going to look at everything. So as I'm going through the things that they measure, you're not going to be analyzing everything. That would be too much. And so you're going to be doing at least two research questions. If you want to do three, that's okay, but at least two research questions that you're going to be analyzing from that research project. And so when you're doing your lab number one, it's going to ask you for two or three research questions that you want to do. And so I highly recommend that you keep that focus. And so as you're listening to this video, don't think, oh my gosh, that's so much. How am I supposed to do that? You're not supposed to do everything. You're just supposed to answer two questions or three questions. And I'll try to give you some examples of research questions as we go through each research project. And so that will give you a little bit of specifics. It would be very helpful for you to watch Lecture 1 if you haven't already. So if you haven't watched Lecture 1, that might be useful because we talk about things like research questions. But basically, research questions are just broad. And so, again, I'll give you some examples as we're going through this. And what I've done here is I've created a very simple overview of the projects. And so I'll go over three projects that you can do, and you'll choose one and you'll write about that in lab number one. We will get into more specifics about each research study as we go along. But right now, let's just keep it simple. Let's keep it simple and focused on what possible questions you want to look at in your own paper. And so the first possible research project is on attachment. And what I'll do is I'll probably put romantic attachment because it really has to do with romantic attachment. So we'll get into this a little bit about what that means. So they have a pretty simple measure of romantic attachment. But let's just talk a little bit about where the data are from. So in this study, they collected data about 4 family members. So within one family, they got data about the father and the mother. So you can see here that these data are heteronormative, and so these are other sex relationships. Uh, I would have to look more at the study. By the way, that's a preface I should make, is that uh, these data I have not looked at. I've gotten data from other researchers, and actually I don't know what the findings are. And what I'll say is your grade is not based on whether there's significant findings. So if you do some analysis and your statistics are not significant, that does not affect your grade. And so anyway, uh, this project, I'm not sure when these data were collected. They may have been collected before same-sex marriage was legal. I'm not sure. So just note that it is heteronormative. So data collected about the father, the mother, adult child number one, and adult child number two. And so there's 4 people in the family. And so I shouldn't say, so some families might have more, but they have data at least from these 4 people. And so for each person, they have data about their romantic attachment. So there's two components of a romantic attachment that they looked at. One is romantic attachment anxiety. So are you anxious in romantic relationships? So that anxiety could show up in various ways. You probably already know what this looks like, but basically, if somebody's anxious, they might be jealous. They might text everybody all the time, their partner all the time. Who are you with? What are you doing? Do you still love me? So they just show a lot of anxiety and nervousness in relationships. And then they also looked at a component about romantic attachment that's called avoidance. This is somebody who cuts off, or this component is about cutting off your emotions. So you avoid commitment, you avoid talking about deep emotions. You keep your partner, at some sort of emotional distance. You don't like to talk about emotions. You don't like to have those deep, intimate emotional connections with other people. So again, I think I'm not going to talk a lot about that right here, but I think everybody kind of knows what we talk about when we talk about anxiety or somebody who is a little bit more closed off and distant and more avoidant. And so for each person, they get a rating on these things in terms of how anxious they are and how avoidant they are. Both of these things are measured in terms of a continuity. So people are measured in terms of being more anxious or less anxious, or more avoidant or less avoidant. So it's on a continuum. Using your statistics, we would consider these to be on an interval level measurement. So again, these scores for being anxious in relationships and being avoidant in relationships, we have it for all four people. We have those scores for father, for mother, for adult child 1, and adult child 2. Also, there's a measure of personality for each of these four people. And they're using the Big Five model. So you probably learned about this in your intro psych, and you might have learned about this in some other courses that you've had beyond intro psych. But what is the Big Five? The Big Five is, you can remember it with ocean, openness to experience. Do you like to try new things? Conscientiousness. Do you make sure that you um, are on time when you meet people? You're conscientious about uh, following rules and making sure that um, you're not a burden on other people. Extroversion. So extroversion is being an extrovert. So I'm not going to really explain a lot about that. I think you know what that means. Agreeableness is that you say yes to everything. So yep, yeah, sure, I'll go along with that. And then neuroticism is having some mental health problems. And so you can remember the Big Five by ocean. So if you look at the first letter, it spells ocean. And so again, they have measures of each of these five aspects of personality for each of the four people. So those are the data there. Those are the constructs. And so I'll give you an example of a research question. So you might ask, does somebody's romantic attachment in terms of anxiety and avoidance, does it relate to their personality? And we could relate it to each of these aspects of it. So that'd be an example research question. Does romantic attachment, anxiety, avoidance relate to personality? So that's an example research question. It's not the only research question that you can have. There's quite a few research questions they can look at here. For example, you could look at within a family, does attachment relate? So if you have an anxious father or mother, do you have anxious children? You could look at personality. So in terms of personality, in terms of the Big Five, do the siblings match the parents? So there's various research questions. So again, choose at least two research questions, and if you have three research questions, I think that's fine also. So that's option number one. Is this romantic attachment study. Option number two is a study about drinking. And by the way, I think these data were collected in Canada. It might have been in Montreal, but I can't quite remember. And probably for most of these studies, we're talking about college students because that's the easiest way to get data. For a lot of psychology researchers, is that they have a bunch of college students sitting there. They can grab them and get data from them. So there's a drinking study. So as I'm going through the study again, remember you don't have to do everything. That's too much. That would be too big of a paper. You just have to have 2 or 3 research questions. So let's look at the data that they collected in this study. So they have demographic data. So they have age, gender, ethnicity in terms of demographics. They measured various aspects about drinking. So they measured the amount, so the quantity that somebody's drinking on average. They also measured motivation for drinking. So why do you drink? They also looked at problems from drinking. So is your drinking causing problems with your job? Is it causing problems with your social relationships? Is it causing problems with your family? Is it causing problems with your school or your schoolwork? So things like that, problems that would occur from drinking. They also measured personality. So some of the things they measure in terms of personality is things like perfectionism. So perfectionism, you want things to be perfect. They have to be in a certain order, or else it's not right. They looked at reward drive. So that's basically, when you do something, you expect something in return. You're driven by some sort of external rewards. They also looked at impulsivity. I think I'm going to change this. So that's somebody who's impulsive. So there's not a lot of control of impulses, which is a really big thing in psychology. So right now, a big thing is looking at whether somebody can control their impulses. And there's some data that suggests that young children who have trouble controlling their impulses are at risk for various negative outcomes later in life. So anyway, there's measures of impulsivity. There's measures in terms of personality for goal drivenness. So are you being driven by some sort of goals that you have? There's also measures of inhibition. So it's kind of opposite of impulsivity. Inhibition is that you feel constricted. You don't act quickly. You're afraid. And then also measures of social anxiety. They also have measures of what they call lifestyle. So they look at how much somebody smokes, how much caffeine do they ingest, do they gamble, and marijuana use. And so the final thing that they measured in the study is perceived social support. So there's quite a bit of things here. So thinking of some research questions could be something like, is somebody's motivation for drinking related to problems from drinking? So if somebody is drinking to avoid thinking about negative things that are going on in their life, is that related to problems from drinking? I would guess that, by the way. Those are 2 things that are help define substance abuse. Is if you're drinking to avoid life and problems and dealing with your problems, that's a motivation that's usually related to substance abuse. And then, the problems from drinking obviously are some aspects of substance abuse too. One of the things that you look at is it causing problems in a person's everyday life? That would be a sign of substance abuse. So that could be one research question. You can see I'm just looking at 2 things. Uh, I could look at something like impulsivity. So if somebody's impulsive, do they drink more? If they're impulsive, do they have more problems from drinking? So you can see here in this data set, given that we've measured I should say the researchers measured quite a few things, there's a ton of research questions that you possibly could derive here. So again, you only have to derive 2 or 3. So again, I should sort of note this. You're just going to choose one research project. You're not going to do something about each. You choose one project, attachment or drinking, or the third one we're going to go through, and you focus on that. So you either do 2 or 3 questions from attachment, or you do 2 or 3 questions from the drinking study, or you do 2 or 3 questions from the other study. You're not doing every study. You just do one. You just focus on one of the three. So I just want to make that very, very clear. Okay, what's the last study? The last study, I'll sort of warn you, is kind of a broad study. It was called an emerging adulthood study. So what they did basically is they looked at college students and they collected it from a lot of different universities. I think it was like over 60 universities. And they have a very large data set with tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people. And they collected different things. And so, just like the drinking study, there's lots of things that could be looked at here. So, what are some of the things that they collected? So, they collected some data about politics. So, they asked the person are you really liberal or are you really conservative, and points in between. So, it's a continuum. And then they also asked about parties. So, are you really strongly a Democrat or strongly a Republican, and points in between? There's measures of subjective well being. So basically, how positive do you feel about your life? There's a measure about sense of belonging. Do you feel connected with other people? Do you feel connected with some group? Or do you feel isolated and alone? They measured self efficacy. So basically, that's do you think you can get things done? Are you a competent person? They also measured perceived social support. So, how much do you feel your friends, family, other people are supporting you in life? They also measured motives for using social media. So they looked at different motivations for using social media. They also measured narcissism. So, narcissism, what are narcissists? Narcissists are those arrogant people who think they're fabulous and great, and they tend to, what we call derogate, they tend to put down other people. Uh, these people tend to be very vulnerable, though. They don't actually have a very strong sense of themselves or their sense of self esteem. So they're very vulnerable inside, but they cover it up by pretending that they're so great and fantastic. And one reason why we know that this is a false sense of self esteem is that they push down other people. I mean, if you really have a good sense of yourself, you don't need to put down other people. But if you probably know people like this, people who are narcissistic and very fragile, they feel a need to put down other people. There's also a measure of perceived stress. So perceived stress in their daily life, and they have different demographic measures such as gender, race/ethnicity, and household income. So again, there is a ton of different types of research questions that you could look at. So you could look at something like, does somebody's motivation for using social media, does it relate to their feelings of self-efficacy? So using what the motivation for using social media, does it relate to how good somebody feels about how competent they are, or you can even ask about how happy they are. Your sense of happiness, does that relate to your motivation for using social media? Those are just examples of research questions. There are literally dozens, if not more, research questions from the study. Again, you're just going to do 2 or 3 of them. So again, in summary, choose one study. You're not going to do more than one study. You're going to focus on one study. You're either going to focus on romantic attachment, or you're going to focus on drinking, or the drinking study, or you're going to focus on the emerging adulthood study. So choose one study, and within that one study, choose 2 or 3 research questions that you're interested in. The lab assignment sort of says this, but Don't worry about being super specific. I just want a general sense of what you're interested in. What things are you interested in? And that will help guide the early parts of your work on your research. So you're going to be doing this for the whole semester. So I'll say one is choose something you're really interested in. Don't say, I'm just going to choose this because it seems easy. Guess what? If you're not really interested in this thing, you're not going to like the semester. So choose something you're interested in so that it helps stimulate your interest and creativity in your paper. And also know that as you work on your research, it's a step by step process. So don't feel like you should know everything right now. You're not supposed to know everything right now. Just right now, choose 2 or 3 questions that interest you, that you think you would like to look at in your research paper. So just focus on those 2 or 3 general questions. Don't worry about being more specific. We'll get more specific as we get to this in a couple weeks when we get to your annotated bibliography. So that's it for the possible research projects. Don't forget to complete the lab assignment number 1 by Sunday, the 16th, I believe. I'm just going to double check that. Yep, the 16th. So I know that you're participating in class and you won't be dropped. So we want to make sure that everybody is attending class that um, is signed up. And so if you have any questions about these data, please let me know. But I tried to simplify it and to make it as straightforward as possible. So take care, and I will talk to you next week.